Hello and welcome back to the Masonic Roundtable, a weekly program where Masons from around the world get together to talk about Masonic news and opinions in a friendly and social manner. As a reminder, the thoughts and opinions expressed here are solely the opinions of the participants and do not represent any Grand Lodge statements or positions. Make sure you keep your conversations open for the public and on the level. To interact with us, send questions and comments to our Twitter page at Mason Roundtable, on our Facebook event page for episode 204, Cognitive Biases, or in the chat running alongside this YouTube video. As for introductions, you know me. My name is John Ruark, past master of the Patriot Lodge number 1957 in Fairfax, Virginia. And next up tonight for introductions, we have Robert Johnson. Robert, say hi.
Hi. RJ here, Waukegan Lodge number 78, past master and current sitting secretary.
Thank you, Robert.
Thanks.
All right. Next up, we have the Juan Sepulveda.
Hello, everybody. Juan Sepulveda here from sunny Kissimmee, Florida, member of Orange Blossom Lodge number 80, and the host of the Winding Stairs Freemasonry podcast.
Thank you, Juan. And last but not least for tonight, Jason Richards.
Good evening, everybody. Jason Richards here, past master of Acacia Lodge number 16 in Clifton, Virginia, member of the Colonial Lodge number 1821 in the District of Columbia.
All right. And here we go. First up for Masonic news, we have a little article coming out of the Grand Lodge of North Carolina. So while I bring up the image, Jason, will you tell us about this wonderful edict?
Yeah, so a couple of us on the show are in the Grand Lodge of North Carolina Facebook page. And there was quite a bit of activity going on over the past week as a ruling came out of the Grand Master, really an edict, banning gun raffles of what the Grand Master calls military-styled weapons. Such as the AR-15, of course, and this is pretty much directly linked to the shootings that happened last week. So this caused a great deal of discussion and consternation, very much of an unbrotherly nature on that Facebook group. And being a moderator of the Winding Stairs Freemasonry Facebook group, I was actually kind of shocked at how awful brethren were being to each other over this edict that the Grand Master of North Carolina put out.
Did you notice that on the Winding Stairs, or you just mean in the other groups?
I meant in the Grand Lodge of North Carolina.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, anytime I post or somebody posts something crazy in Winding Stairs, like, it gets all ramped up, and then everybody's like, okay.
Yeah, well, that's usually because the rest of the moderators come in and start banning people.
Yeah, we show presence.
But I mean, it was just, I have never seen a Masonic Facebook group get that ugly as the North Carolina Grand Lodge one did.
Except with women in Masonry. God damn him.
Oh, yeah.
That gets pretty ugly, but...
Should women be Freemasons?
Oh, post a comment below if you think that's the end of our YouTube channel.
That's it.
Don't do it.
You overloaded the Google. Okay. Well, I know Jason's going to talk some more about that specific edict later in one of his musings, but let's get right to it because we have a lot of material to cover for tonight. Tonight's episode is on cognitive biases. And if you remember, we did an episode way back in the beginning when we were applying the liberal art of logic to logical fallacies. The same website that kind of codifies it in a nice, simple way came out with an update this year called Your Bias Is. And so what we'll do is break through some of the cognitive biases one may have just due to human nature alone and how we exhibit those, how we see them in, I don't know, your conversations with your friends and brothers in Lodge and on Facebook and other aspects of life, and then how you can kind of be aware and hopefully correct for some of those. So without further ado, we're going to do this round robin style, and I'll start and we'll just keep going down the line until we reach our limit for tonight, starting with the cognitive bias of anchoring. Now, this one's really interesting because basically what it does is it takes a concept of if you're the first one to posit an idea, all other ideas are weighted against that. So the perfect example I can think of is if you ever watch the TV show Pawn Stars, when they're bringing in something and they want to barter to either trade or sell it. When they sell it, whoever puts the dollar figure out first is anchoring at that dollar figure. And so every conversation is based around higher or lower than that dollar figure. So whoever goes first and whoever sets this thing, scientifically, it's been proven that we really can't resist the anchoring effect. But once you're aware of it, then you can hopefully try to counteract that. Here's an example of where you might see this happen in Lodge. I know when we do some charitable things for, like, say, the youth groups, when we get piece of paper across the desk that says, "Hey, the Job's daughters are looking for some money to help with their raffle or their pancake breakfast. Does anyone have any suggestions of how much we should give them?" The first person to stand up will say, I recommend that we give them $100. Does anyone else?
What did we give them last year?
Well, that's usually the first question. But if we don't know, because no one really does, whoever sets that first dollar figure, whatever the lodge comes up with will usually be close to that dollar figure. So be aware of that and make sure that if you agree with that, great. If not, make sure that you're not caught in the anchoring trap. Okay. Next one, we'll move to Robert Johnson for the first one on his list. Go ahead, Robert.
All right, so the first one I have is self-serving bias. This is when we can't say anything bad about ourselves, right? When something good happens, it's because we were awesome, and when something bad happens, it's because it's somebody else's fault. You might see this in Lodge if you hear somebody complain about a degree going bad. Maybe a senior officer, or maybe you might see this because this degree was particularly amazing because I was out doing the obligation, whatever that might be. And I'll steer away from politics here, but I will tell you that self-serving bias is extremely prevalent in politics today. Everything that's good has happened, amazing. Everything bad happens, the other guy's fault, whoever was, in position before me. So that's the long and the short of self-serving biases.
It's really good. Thank you, Robert. Next,
You're welcome.
Juan Sepulveda for your first cognitive bias.
Okay. My cognitive bias, let me go to the right screen here to make sure I'm saying this right. I'm going to start by doing a little example. Okay. I'm going to describe one of the brothers in the Masonic Roundtable. And I would hope that you guys pay attention so that you can see if this is you or not. You tend to be very attentive to details, and you like to be able to find those connections that other people might miss. The brother I'm talking about is also a little controversial at times with things that he says, but quickly notices that he doesn't want to disrupt the harmony, and he wants to bring things back down to preserve the harmony. Stimulated by facts, aversive to fake things. Who am I talking about? Anybody?
Juan Sepulveda.
I'm going to say Robert.
Robert, who do you think it is?
Maybe it's everybody, but I'm gonna go with Juan.
You go with me?
Maybe, yeah, it could be you. I know I've made controversial statements, but I'm not sure that all of us have ever not made those kind of statements.
Well, it's all of you.
So I'm right.
Yeah, I could have been describing any one of you. You might have thought, oh, maybe he's talking about me. Oh, no, maybe he's talking about Robert. Maybe he's talking about this other person. This is called the Barnum effect. It's also called the Forer effect. And it's a phenomenon whereby individuals give high accuracy rating to something that they that they believe they are a part of. So I can give a very general description of something, and you think, oh, yeah, I agree with that. That's exactly how I am. And I say something a little bit vague, and you might have seen this in the zodiac. If you look at what is that called? The horoscope. When you look at your horoscope, a lot of times you read it and it's uncanny how similar it is to what you're going through, or some of your life experiences, but not really. It's just vague enough that you are going to see yourself in it somehow. So where will we find this in? I struggle with this. I don't know if anything came to mind for you, brothers, but like I try to think about when someone is describing a position of a past master, perhaps, and they identify themselves. Yeah, actually, yeah, I can be a little bit like that, but I don't have a concrete example for it. What do you think?
I think like when you're at Grand Lodge and they're about to like announce the Mason of the Year or something, and they're like, "This brother's done this. He's done this. He's done this." And there's all these guys like, ooh, yeah, that's me. I did that. Oh, I did that. Oh, I know you did that, Bob. Oh. And then they're just like, they name some dude who nobody's heard of, but he's just like some regular lodge dude who gets up and he's like totally shocked, right? Like they actually maybe give it to somebody who's not one of these other guys. Yeah. So I see that all the time. And it just made me think about, do you guys remember when there was like the Oscars like years ago where Kate Winslet stood up because she thought she was getting it and they announced somebody else's name?
Ouch.
Yeah, it was terrible.
Or like Michael Keaton folding the acceptance speech back in his pocket after they announced someone else.
Oh,
yes.
Yeah.
So good.
Good stuff. All right. Thank you, Juan. Let's move on to Jason for his first bias.
All right. My first bias that I'm going to talk about tonight is reactance. And reactance is the bias where if you have someone, pressuring you to do something, especially if it's in a manipulative or coercive manner, your fight or flight response is going to kick in and you're automatically going to prefer to do the opposite of what that person is trying to get you to do. And one of the key areas in my own life where I struggle with this bias, behavior kind of drives me crazy, but is when in lodge we host like we'll host like a Scottish Rite night or a Royal Arch night or a Shrine night, and invariably what'll happen is the speaker will get up in lodge and he'll say, all right, raise your hand if you're not X, not a Shriner. And I'm usually one to raise my hand, and then the speaker will sit there for half an hour being like, okay, you guys need to get him a petition. Why haven't you joined? Blah, 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 blah. I've actually been put on the spot because I raised my hand because I wasn't a part of a group. And I have to say part of my bias kicks in there and says, well, screw you. I'm never going to join that group. And so I have to kind of calm myself down and say, okay, you know what? There are merits to being, in this group. It's just not the right time, etc. But that's one way where reactance as a cognitive bias plays out in my own personal Masonic experience.
That's interesting. Thank you. Let's see. Next up for me, we have one of my all-time favorites, which is the sunk cost fallacy. Specifically, that is an economic term that applies to the sense of where I've put so much money into it already, I should keep going because we're so close to the finish line, even when you're throwing good money at bad, and it's actually better economically to just stop. Have you ever had a car where you knew it was kind of at the end of life and you're like, oh, but I just got to replace the brakes. And then next month, well, I just got to replace, the front bumper. And you just keep throwing this money in this thing and you're like, I know I should stop, but it's only another $300. Let me get past this month. and all you're doing is applying this sunk cost fallacy. I put so much into it already because you're emotionally invested now into the upkeep of this car. A perfect example right now is the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, which in the Department of Defense has already accrued up to $406.5 billion in development costs.
Should have stuck with the 22.
And they're estimating now all the way through 2070, the year 2070, that there's going to be $1.508 trillion in total costs of this thing. Meanwhile, we're fighting a cyber war. So I don't know what these aircraft are going to do to help shoot down the digital packets on the dark web. So, here's an example where there's going to be schedule delays and throwing more good money at bad. So a Lodge example could be where, we're always doing our Lodge fundraiser. Well, we really haven't raised a lot of money doing that. Yeah, but it's tradition. And so there's a good example of that. A real world example that I can also think of as it pertains to Masonry is I was looking at some of the tax paperwork for the Shriners Hospital, and that charity itself actually lost money in fundraising during the 2016 report. So in other words, they spent more money on fundraising than they did actually gaining funds. I'm not saying it's not a good charity. I'm saying that someone should look at, is it worth investing all that time and money into something that's not getting the return? So food for thought. Think about that.
Lodges, consolidation, perhaps?
Oh, that's a great one. That's a perfect example.
Yep. And of course, it's easier said than done because there's emotional attachment to a lot of things. If you're starting a business and it's failing, before you actually pull the plug, like that's your baby. You don't want to just let it go. Same thing happens with a building, happens with an organization. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Love it. Thank you, Juan. RJ, you're up next.
Yeah, I'm glad you threw that out there, Juan. That's immediately what I went to, just dumping money into a lodge. So the next one is the groupthink bias. And as I was researching this, there were a couple of things that really stood out to me. Number one, I feel like our fraternity is wildly guilty of this groupthink bias. Okay. I went and I searched around. Wikipedia is always a great resource. I don't care what you say. But basically, when the desire for harmony and conformity results in bad decision process. So right away, we should be thinking about progressive lines. We should be thinking about not hurting a brother's feelings, so we're going to do this anyway. They're leaving behind critical evaluations. And the best part about the Wikipedia definition of this was, quote, they suppress dissenting viewpoints and isolate themselves from the outside influence. So, like, the world can change around us, yet we're going to stay the same, even when it's proven we're wrong, right? Like, it's a bad situation to be in. Examples would be like when any other, say there's an edict that comes out in another jurisdiction, like Jason brought up, right? Our immediate dissent, we just shut it down. Nope. Like when I posted this personally, like that article about that edict, immediately somebody said, well, that's not Illinois. We don't need to talk about that. I was like, oh, okay. Or, when you post something really cool on your Grand Lodge website, but, a moderator just deletes it right away because it doesn't, they don't want to have meaningful discussion, or maybe the meaningful discussion is, a little too out the comfort zone for most folks or whatever. So, we don't want to have any outside influence. So we're just going to shut it down right now. So that's the groupthink bias. And it's kind of a bummer, really.
Bro, but if you're going to post it on Friday night and ruin my weekend, I'm deleting that ish. We'll talk about it on Monday.
Yeah. All right.
So would a good example of this be, but we've always done it that way?
Yeah, I think that fits in there somehow, right? Because we're looking at something that is different than what we've done. Yeah.
There you go.
So that's really good.
Careful for the groupthink bias.
Yeah.
Always done it that way. Cool, Leo. Let's see. Thank you for that, RJ. Next, we have. Who do we have next? We have Juan.
My new button was hiding from me. Okay, our next one up. Alexa didn't understand me when I first mentioned it, but it's declinism. Am I saying that right? Or declinism. Declinism is the belief that a particular country, society, or institution is in a state of significant and possibly irreversible decline. Does that sound familiar to anybody? And I know exactly what you just read, John. Masonry is dead. This is
I just saw that in the show notes right now, and you got me, man. You got.
I saw it on your face. Well, it's that feeling that things are just getting worse and worse. We might as well just throw our hands up. There's no way to fix this. And just to put this in context, I'm going to read a quote to you. And it says, "The children now love luxury. They have bad manners, contempt for authority. They show disrespect for elders and love chatter in place of exercise." Does that sound like today's youth?
Yeah.
It doesn't, right? Well, this was Socrates back in the 4th century BC. Is that the 4th century? Always the BC screws me up.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So 300, and he died in 399 BC. So we're talking about this happened before Christ, and people then were already throwing their hands up about these millennials. Oh my God. Like every generation has a young generation that they believe is the culprit of the decline. And you might have some brothers in authority within our fraternity that might put in doubt our dedication to the fraternity based on whatever attempts we might make to improve upon practices, increase efficiency, perhaps bring an old organization into the modern era. And they might see that as the inevitable decline of their precious organization. But I bet you if we look 200 years in the future, people are going to look back at some of the people that are really making a difference in today's Masonry, and they will then compare the next generation. They'll put in doubt whatever the next generation is trying to do. So just because some people feel our organization is in decline, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's an irreversible and inevitable demise.
Wow.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think a student recently said something along the lines of, "Yeah, it's okay, because you're gonna die, and we're gonna change it." I was like, "Well, okay."
There's not much we can say to that, right? It's like, I guess you got me. If I'll kill you first, little brat.
You will too, bro. And then someone's going to come back behind you and change it.
That's right.
Next up, Jason Richards.
All right. So the next cognitive bias I'm going to talk about is belief bias. And this actually goes kind of hand in hand with confirmation bias, which is one of my favorite ones. John, get out of the show notes. I got it taken care of. Confirmation bias is one of my favorite biases, but belief bias is very closely linked to it, in the sense that it's the bias that occurs when you are really willing to rationalize anything that supports a conclusion that supports your own personal belief. So if a conclusion supports your own personal belief, you'll rationalize anything that supports it. So I actually have an anonymized screen cap from our favorite Facebook group, the Winding Stairs Freemasonry group. that essentially is an article on disharmony in the lodge. It's not a bug; it's a feature. And if you scroll down, unfortunately, the quote in question is partially obscured by Juan's head. But what it says is it's a gentleman who's talking about harmony and disharmony in the lodge. And this gentleman says, the old guard is always resistant to change, and the younger Masons are quick to change. You have to find a happy medium. I'm like, that is specifically chock full of logical fallacies, talking about always having to find a middle ground. That's a stereotypical logical fallacy. But at the same time, how many people are like, yeah, no, I mean that totally makes sense. Like, yeah, the old guards, these old guys in my lodge, they hate change. And so since this argument plays off of or caters to some brothers' beliefs about generational politics and generational differences, they might be more willing to overlook the logical fallacy presented in there and see that argument as a solid basis for or as solid just because it confirms your own beliefs on something. If that makes any sense.
It does. So that's a good segue into my next one, which is confirmation bias. So belief bias is, again, as Jason said, now confirmation bias is taking that to the next logical step of now only favoring those things that align to your current beliefs. You may have heard it called the echo chamber of Facebook, right? Where you only subscribe to certain groups that you want to hear about and that favor your opinion. You may only watch one news network that aligns toward your political agenda. But Wikipedia puts it, confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information in a way that confirms one's pre-existing beliefs or hypotheses. Yes, this is really Facebook to a T in most of the threads, channels, and even peers that I see go over this. But yet this can still happen at a lodge level as well, right? Because, I mean, if you're part of any sort of subculture of Masonry, whether it be, say, the traditional observance movement, right? You could say, well, everyone should be traditional observance. And here's all this research papers I've read where traditional observance is a good thing, right? Well, have you read the other ones, right? Have you gone out and done a comparison? And actually, I'll give you one pro tip of how to beat confirmation bias. And the obvious one is to actually pay attention to and listen to countering viewpoints. Make an effort to be aware of where you lean and then listen to an editorial or something on the opposite viewpoint. And I saw something on a YouTube video recently, which was really cool, where they said, have you ever heard of the Turing test? Where Alan Turing in the 50s came up with this thing where maybe one day computers will be so smart when you're chatting with them, you won't know if it's a computer or a human. So someone came up with the concept of a reverse Turing test in the sense of, can you debate someone else's viewpoint so articulately that they believe that you believe counter to what you do believe? In other words, do you believe what, could you have a counter viewpoint that they think you're on their side for? So an example would be, if you are pro-gun versus anti-gun, that could you create such a compelling anti-gun argument that someone who is anti-gun says, yeah, you're on my side, I agree with you, when in fact you are trying to apply this concept of breaking confirmation bias, understand the opposing viewpoint so clearly that you can now have a higher level of debate. So that is confirmation bias. Okay, Robert, you're next.
All right, so the next one I have is negativity bias. So in short, a quick anecdote would be like, John passed go. He collected $200, but he landed on Reading Railroad, and I own all 4 of them. So he has to immediately just give me that $200, and all he focuses on is the loss of money.
Like every time.
Never mind the fact that he went around the board again. He lost money. It's a psychological problem in many cases, along with most of these have some sort of underlying psychological like impact. But so like in the fraternity, maybe I'm guilty of negativity bias quite often. And this is like when I get bummed out. Sometimes people say it's your Masonic time of the month because once a month or more, I get really bummed out about the current state of affairs or whatever. And it's just a phase that we all go through. And so we're focusing on the negative. We're letting the negative things that are in our lives affect us more than the positive things. And generally, you pull yourself out real quick. Like, what am I doing? But sometimes that people just live in that, right? And so, like John alluded to, social media like lives in some of these. And I tend to find like the negativity bias is another big one. Like we talked about the echo chamber, right? Like you can unfollow all these people, and pretty soon all you're left with is corresponding viewpoints of what you like to see. So that's dangerous. Maybe disharmonious. I don't know, like in your own head or whatever, but the same with negativity bias. You're going to you will continually complain, right? A complainer, bad things always happen to complainers. It's just the way it is.
Well, and you think about it, you go to a lodge meeting with a certain brother, you have a fantastic lodge meeting that night, and then you're getting ready for bed and you check Facebook, and this same brother just posts a huge diatribe contrary to your own viewpoint on Facebook. And all of a sudden you're just like, oh, what's a jackass?
Yeah. That, or somebody thought was really cool post something extremely racist. It's happened time and time again.
Yeah.
I digress. Next song.
Well, there you go. The next song goes to Juan Sepulveda.
All right. I did want to mention that we've had some conversations here on the YouTube chat, and part of the thing that people are finding is that it's happened. They recognize all these things. They recognize them, and that's the whole point of us going through them. I describe it like a good martial artist that goes into the octagon. If his game is good on his feet in boxing, well, he might go a little bit far in the round, but he needs to be well-rounded. If he doesn't know how to drop people down and how to do ground and pound and some jiu-jitsu on the floor, then they're in trouble. And that's how I compare the grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Recognizing what these moves are help you react to them when you find them out there in a real battle scenario, as opposed to being at the mercy of being choked out, rear naked choke on every swing. That is the comparison that I have. So this might not be interesting to everybody. I find it fascinating. I could read a book on this stuff, day in and day out. But some people might find it a little tedious. The important thing is like you need to be on your best game so that when you're out there, people are not bamboozling you and you're able to, handle your own. All right, so quickly moving on to my cognitive bias is the framing effect. And I found a description that says, this is when people react to a particular choice in different ways depending on how it is presented. For example, the loss as a loss or a gain. People tend to avoid risk when a positive frame is presented, but seek risk when a negative frame is presented. And this is something that really has an effect on risk-averse people. And the example I wanted to show about Masonry is that if you're in a lodge meeting and you have a proposal to present to your brothers about a change that you would like to see enacted in your lodge. The way in which you frame that that idea, it's going to have a direct effect on whether your brothers support you or resist you. So don't just say something because you think it's a good idea. You have to be strategic in how you present it. Because you could have the one idea that is going to save that fundraiser, the idea that's really going to make a difference in the new members of the lodge or in your community. But if you hack at it when you're talking and you're not being proper in your communication and you're not being effective in your delivery, then you are cheating your lodge out of that solution and you're cheating that brother out of that possible benefit. So no pressure.
So I have an example, right? In the framing effect, given two options, would you rather have a 30% chance of dying of cancer or a 70% chance of surviving cancer? They're exactly the same scenario, but it's how you frame the question of whether you say it more optimistic or pessimistic, right? So when you want to say, you know, I propose we raise dues, you could say, you know, I would rather, you know, put on the table that we increase the solvency of the lodge and therefore have the ability to provide more charity and more fundraisers by increasing dues, instead of I'd rather make sure everyone's dues go up $5 a month, you know, in perpetuity, and make sure that, I know it's gonna be hard, guys, but you're gonna have to, you know, kind of tighten the belt a little bit.
Suck it up.
But it's the same thing.
Yeah.
How you frame it makes a big difference. That's a great one.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Juan. Jason, you're up.
All right. So next up on the cognitive bias wheel of pain is the in-group bias. So this is something that we as Masons are taught to use. And the bias goes as such. You unfairly favor those who belong to your group and those who are most like you. And we're taught from, you know, the very first day that Masons are special and you know, deserve our, you know, care and treatment, you know, above all others. So, you know, one of the notes that I jotted down was, you know, I've seen cases where someone who's a Freemason is accused of you know, illegal activity, and folks will say, "Oh no, he would never do that. He's a Mason after all," and that's a cognitive bias. So, you know, one way to get around that is, again, to kind of picture yourself as someone not in the same group, and try to keep an objective viewpoint. But yeah, as Masons, we're taught to take care of our brethren, and we're taught to value our brethren. And our natural inclination, you know, when I see a guy with a square and compass decal on his car, you know, passing me while I'm on my way to work, I'm automatically like, oh, hey, I bet he's a good guy. Literally. That's just the way we're wired.
That's fascinating about the psychology of the group dynamics, and then how we apply that to preconceived notions of someone we've never met. It's fascinating. Okay, looks like I'm back up. The next one that is fascinating is the one called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Dunning-Kruger effect is named after two guys, Mr. Dunning and Mr. Kruger, in which, in summary, they basically say that the dumber someone is, the more important they think they are, or the smarter they think they are. And conversely, the smarter someone is, the more they realize they don't know, and so they will often downplay their abilities. So you'll see this in management. You'll see, people who, slept at a Holiday Inn last night, read a couple for Dummies books, and the next thing you know, they're the expert, and they're like, "Oh man, I know all about this thing," when they're actually, very ill-informed and overemphasize their talent, skills, and abilities. Also, you'll see a lot of guys who are very humble, and maybe the world's expert in something, some X, and next thing you know, you could say, well, he doesn't know much. He doesn't speak up. He doesn't really, flaunt it, right? Because he knows what he doesn't know. I mean, I think I read a similar point that basically says, the older I get, the more I realize what I don't know, and that's very true from a reverse Dunning-Kruger effect. And in a Masonic context, I think the perfect example of this are title chasers. There's people who chase the title, chase the jewel, chase the badge, chase the apron. But see, I'm 33rd degree, Knight Templar. I'm in this group that you're not allowed to be in, and so therefore I have perceived importance over you. Whereas there are brothers who have all those same titles, and when you ask them to be introduced in lodge, they say, "Brother's fine. Just introduce me as brother." That's the difference. That's the Dunning-Kruger effect in Masonry, is those who go for those titles and those who would just rather be called brother. Robert, you're up.
All right, so my next one kind of touches a little bit on what Jason talked about. A lot of these have a similar string that go through them, so it's not going to be uncommon that you're going to hear similar themes in these biases. But the next one I'll talk about is halo effect. In short, you're cherry picking the good things somebody does and placing a really high value on that, a high weight. They could be a total creep, but you think they're cute, or whatever the case might be, and you're just basing your opinion of somebody on how they act or what they did one time or whatever. You see it in the political spectrum when you go to the voting booth and you just pick the name that sounds coolest or the name that sounds friendly or whatever the case might be. In Freemasonry, it sounds terrible, There's good and bad in every group, and we would just be lying to ourselves if we said all Masons were amazing. There are some Masons that are not amazing. We have plenty of jerks. And I think a halo effect is, if somebody on the outside might say, "Hey, that guy's a Mason. He's good." Like Jason said, it kind of goes on the outside of the fraternity as well. Like we've pumped up this image, and maybe we give some money to charity or whatever, but maybe we're a ding dong. Who knows?
I've seen it too. You could use that same point I was making earlier about title chasers. You ever seen the old guys who are like, 90 years old that stroll in the lodge with all these jewels and insignia that you've never seen before, and you're like, I don't know what that is. I don't know what that. He's got to be important though, right?
Yeah. Well, half that shit stuff you buy. Sorry.
Right. Well, see, but I mean, I know for me, as a young Mason, as an entered apprentice, fellow craft, brand new master Mason, I see these guys walk in with all sorts of things jingling on their chest, and I'm like, they must be pretty important. Like that's impressive. So the mere fact that they have jewelry that other guys don't gives them that halo effect.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah. Okay, Juan, you're next.
Okay, this one I'll admit was a little bit challenging. I had to go through it because it reminds me a lot of other cognitive biases. So I'll give it a go. It's called the fundamental attribution error, also known as the correspondence bias. And I think part of it is the name that was given to it that kind of like throws me for a loop. And basically is described as the claim that, in contrast to interpretations we see people place undue emphasis on internal characteristics of the agent rather than the external factors in explaining people's behavior. For example, when some people describe it as a tendency to believe that what other people do reflects who they are. And what kind of like made it gel for me was a description that said that in an experiment that they did, they had the subjects evaluate or judge what other people, um, that things that happened to other people were a consequence of who they were. And the percentages that said, yeah, that happened to them because who they are was in the high 60s. But when something happened to them, they were less prone to say that those things happened to them because of who they were or how they were. And the percentage there was it was in the 40s. It was in the low 40s. So kind of showing that people, in a sense, are harsher judges of others than they are of themselves. And they don't want to see in themselves they don't want to attribute to their fundamentals the blame for things that happen to them, but they're at the ready to say, you see, that happened to him because he's a jerk, or because he's this or the other. So
yeah, I know. I think another good example could be if you see a guy who always shows up late to meetings or just in time for meetings, and you're like, what is he committed or not to this fraternity we have, right? Or never shows up for meetings. So okay, I'm gonna call you out, Juan.
Yeah.
You admit you haven't been to lodge in a long time, and someone could say, how dare he try to be a representative of the craft at the same time, never go to the lodge. And so that means they could put a fundamental attribution error as therefore he doesn't respect the craft. Whereas people may not know that you're trying to be a full-time dad, and you're trying to run a job at home, as 24 hours a day. It's not as easy for you to get out. You're covering all bases, and really getting out for lodge to you is really a rare event because of your family circumstances. And so not that you need to explain that to somebody, but the mere fact that is your situation, and then someone can have a fundamental attribution error and say he's just not committed to masonry.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I've been this close to standing in front of lodge and talking to the brothers to like tell them exactly, listen, I suspect that some of you might think this or the other. Here's what it is. Ask me anything, pretty much. And that, and I've taken it back, because it's like I almost see it as well, I'm giving out an excuse for not going to lodge or anything, and someone who's judging me harshly just doesn't know me. So, but it's funny because I've been that close to doing it. It's like they probably don't even know I'm a member of the lodge. It's like, who's this fool?
Yeah, but then also, like, when you look at it in some terms like that, you want to get up there and maybe say something, but then you don't, because also, like, I think I would feel, it happened to me one time. Somebody said something and I was like, yeah, whatever. I had, doing the podcast, or we're doing this show. I used to catch flack all the time for not going to Royal Arch chapter meetings because I was doing this show. And I was like, yeah, well, I mean, we're affecting greater change. Sorry. Like, you didn't, they have a preconceived notion about how or what I was doing with my time.
Sorry, I offended you with my friendship.
Sorry, I offended you with my friendship. Yeah.
All right. I think, given the time, Jason's going to be the last one for this go around. So, Jason, make it a good one.
All right. All right. So the last cognitive bias that I'm going to talk about tonight is the curse of knowledge, which is, I think, something that I fall into and I struggle with quite a bit. The curse of knowledge bias is when once you understand something, a concept, an idea, the line of thinking, you automatically presume that that line of thinking or that concept and understanding it should just be obvious to everyone. And you forget the fact that there was a time when you yourself didn't quite get it or had to reframe your thinking. So I have another example of this from social media, and I have a writer's page, Jason M. Richards on Facebook, and I was coming back from a road trip, I think with Frater O, and I was like, you know what? When we talk about esoteric knowledge being really hidden and only for the very select few, is it possible for an esoteric concept or a piece of esoteric knowledge to become so widely known that it in and of itself fails to adhere to the definition of esoteric, and it ceases to be esoteric? And I had a well-intentioned brother, basically, who has spent a lot of time studying the esoteric, say, well, I would contend that if you're asking this question, the thing about which you're speaking was never esoteric to begin with. So I tried to tease it out and say, okay, well, explain. And the brother came back and said, well, why don't you just meditate on it? And this was a case where this brother had a line of thinking or a conceptual framework or viewpoint that he had established, and he just felt it should just be obvious to absolutely everyone. And when I when I focus on the initiatic of experience of Freemasonry being the real secret of Freemasonry, I've talked about that a lot on this show. I just tend to presume it's like, well, everybody should understand that the degree system and the initiatic experience and the light you gain is just the coolest part of Freemasonry. And then I've got Bob over here who's like, nah, man, I really just like going and drinking beer with my buddies, like after lodge. That's the best part of Freemasonry for me. I have to check myself and my own assumptions to say, okay, just because I have this viewpoint and I have this knowledge doesn't mean that someone else does too. You see this a lot in catechism coaching as well, and catechism mentoring, because it takes a long time in a lot of cases. And once you finally have that knowledge ingrained, you can feel yourself getting frustrated with students who are just having a hard time grasping it. And it's just like, no, we've been over this for the past 30 minutes, the same 5 words. What is wrong with you? And that's another piece of the curse of knowledge, cognitive bias. So I know I posted a couple anonymized screen caps from Facebook that was not meant to call anybody out per se. It's just some good examples, and I think everybody would agree that while we're keeping our examples to Masonry to establish kind of the relevance and arm the viewers with the ability to recognize those cognitive biases when they come up in the craft, our intention tonight is not to just crap on Masonry. You've got cognitive biases and people using cognitive biases in every part of your life. We just tried to make it as relevant to the craft and the show as possible.
That sounds like a perfect way to start wrapping things up. Robert, why don't you start us off with final thoughts and shameless plugs?
First of all, amazing conversation. Just through hearing about the other ones and the ones that we discussed personally really made us reflect on what we were seeing and what we have seen in the craft. One of the things that we had all decided to try and do, and only Jason was able to tease it out, was to scour social media and to try to find examples of this. And what I found was that it was too difficult for me to pick one example for each thing. It was just so much. I would see it everywhere. And as John pointed out, social media in and of itself is one giant bias. It is literally a bias machine. So it's dangerous in that aspect. I mean, unless you're pulling, news feeds from Fox, NPR, and CNN, and Reuters all together, and you get all of those, kudos to you. But most of us don't do that. So it was really a growth topic. When we talk about Freemasonry, we always say that we're making good men better, and we don't always explain or expound on how to do that. And one of the neat things about exploring cognitive biases, exploring logical fallacies, is it really does it makes us look internal, and hopefully we're recognizing when we're doing those same things. And when we start to do them, we can pull back and change our action plan. So just recognize, I mean, a lot of us aren't going to be able to do that. It's not comfortable to do that, but that's growth. So thanks for watching this show. It means a lot to all of us that you guys tune in all the time. If you guys like Masonic podcasts, Sunday nights, 9:30, Whence Came You? We just had a really good topical conversation on the number 7 with Frodero and Robert E. Jackson, who is a past master and current master of his lodge. And it was really a fun topic. And if you listened all the way to the end, you got to hear some goofy stuff. But that's it. Thanks so much for watching, everybody.
Sweet. You, Robert? Juan Sepulveda, final thoughts.
As always, it was a pleasure. This was a fun one to prepare for and to discuss. I have an affinity for the liberal arts and sciences. Just a little, I don't know how many people know this, but the reason I call it the winding stairs is because of the various steps of the winding stairs and what they represent. So the original intent was to go through all those steps in my own journey and share that journey with everybody. So I've skipped some steps and come back to a few at the beginning, but it's a journey that I really enjoy. And I hope that you find pleasure in these, that you are able to get curious about more of these cognitive biases and actually go out there and find them, familiarize yourself with them. If you find any good examples in the Winding Stairs group, in the Masonic Roundtable, in Whence Came You, let us know. If you can take a screenshot and hide the names of the people that are using these biases, like share those so that we can learn from them. Imagine if we go out in the real world and we were armed with the knowledge of these biases or the different logical fallacies. We're able to defend ourselves better from people who are trying to gain advantage from us. So these are incredible tools that are at your disposal. We enjoy talking about them. So if you have questions, feel free to ask them. And thank you for joining us here on the Masonic Roundtable. And as I say goodbye, I invite you brothers to go to freemasonryart.com. I have a few t-shirts in this design left. This is the 300th anniversary. I don't know why I'm doing that, because I could stand up. And oh yeah, thank you for that. And there's a couple of designs I have. I can ship those out today. So go support the show by doing that. And while you're at it, I don't know if we mentioned it or not, but we have the patent for the TMR 300 available. So just grab a couple of those and support the shows you love. Thank you, brothers.
Thank you, Juan. Jason.
All right. I kind of already did my my final thought, but I love going through the exercise of rhetoric and logic and figuring out bias and logical fallacies, because they're just so incredibly prevalent across the scope of human communication. So, we've said on this show a number of times there's an inherent there's an inherent positive aspect to self-knowledge and introspection. And one of the ways that you can become a more effective Mason, a more effective communicator, is to do some serious introspection and take a look at these cognitive biases and logical fallacies, and figure out which traps you fall into most often. That's a great way to work on yourself as a communicator, a man, a Mason, a brother, and a friend. And with that, I'll just send it back to you to take us home, John.
Awesome. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, you too can check out these and many more on your local interwebs. The closest one is yourbias.is. That's right. There's no www, but just go into your web browser and type yourbias.is. Your bias is, and you get to a page where you can click on the various select cognitive biases here, brought to you by the friends who brought you yourlogicalfallacies.com. There's many more Wikipedia. This is really just a subset, kind of the most popular ones. And the real takeaway for this is we are all guilty of this, every single one of us, because we're human. And that's really the big takeaway here. It's not things to judge about other people. It's things to look upon yourself and say, I'm guilty of doing that. And unfortunately, some of these things are subconscious, right? It's just based on human nature. And so the whole point of this episode is bringing it back to Masonry is if we are here to apply grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and specifically rhetoric and logic, and understanding the debate structure, understanding these different techniques of how do we form ideas and how do we interpret ideas, these cognitive biases are going to be filters that you're going to have to overcome in order to widen your aperture, take different viewpoints. So I challenge every single one of you here to think about some of these we've talked about tonight, and many more. Go do your homework, but go out and find an alternate viewpoint and try to be that human Turing test to see if maybe on one small topic, maybe something that's really popular in the news right now, can I sit back and take a step back from my emotions of this heated debate, and can I form a cogent debate as if I were on the other side? And do I understand the other side well enough that I could reasonably have a one-sided debate with the opposition? And so that will, if nothing else, give you the cognitive exercise of trying to see something from another person's point of view, thereby extending peace and harmony to others and to the lodge. That's all I've got. This has been great. I learned a lot. And again, we'll see you next week. Thank you very much for watching, and keep searching for more light. Have a good night.